This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, we explore the mysterious castle of Gormenghast, the setting of Titus Groan by Mervyn Peake, with writer and editor Rob Maslen. Titus Groan begins with the birth of an heir to Lord Groan, the ruler of the castle of Gormenghast. As baby Titus comes into the world, the castle is beset by scheming and violence, primarily at the hands of Steerpike, an exceptionally clever but malevolent teenager. As he manipulates the other residents of the castle, his plotting threatens the traditions and rules that govern life within its walls, bringing madness and death to the Groan family. Mervyn Peake was born in 1911 in China, where his father was a medical missionary. After returning to England in 1922, he studied at the Croydon School of Art and the Royal Academy of Art. After building a reputation as an artist and illustrator during the Second World War, he published the novels that make up the Gormenghast trilogy between 1946 and 1959. He went on to publish novels, poetry and books of artwork. He died in 1968. Rob Maslen is Emeritus Professor at the University of Glasgow. In 2015, he founded Glasgow's MLit in Fantasy, the first graduate programme in the world specifically dedicated to the study of fantasy and the fantastic. And from 2020 to 2022, he served as co-director of the Glasgow Centre of Fantasy and the Fantastic. He's written 3 books, Elizabethan Fictions, Shakespeare and Comedy, and The Shakespeare Handbook, and has edited Sir Philip Sidney's Apology for Poetry and Mervyn Peake's collected poems, as well as co-editing Mervyn Peake's Complete Nonsense. He has published many essays on early modern literature and 20th century fantasy and science fiction, and he blogs at the City of Lost Books. For all of the relevant links and a list of books mentioned, head to the description of this episode. I'm Graham Foster, and I spoke to Rob Maslen about Titus Groan by Mervyn Peake in April 2025. Robert, thanks for joining us on the 99 Novels podcast. It's great to have you here to talk about Mervyn Peake.
It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited to begin.
Why don't we begin with trying to describe the book for someone who may not have read the book recently or at all? How would you describe the book to them?
It's quite difficult to give a sense of just how strange it is and unique. It's something that Burgess emphasizes in his introduction, that it's a book that's rather unlike any other. But you get a sense of it by thinking that it's about a gigantic castle, one which we're never given a complete overview of. So we're always discovering new reaches and corridors and hidden staircases and attics and so on in this vast accumulated building, which has been built up over many, many generations. When we begin the novel, it's in the time of the 76th Earl of Groan, who is the ruler of the castle. And in the course of the novel, a young man who is employed in the kitchens of the castle of Gormenghast gradually rises to power, aims to seize power for himself. It's a kind of enormous game for him. And in the process, he explores the castle and discovers its bizarre inhabitants, its denizens, all of whom are kind of strange, and they feel as though they've organically grown from the structure of the castle itself. Now, the castle, too, is kind of represented as if it was something of a character, a living being. It kind of throbs, it breathes, it changes with the changing season. But governing the castle and its inhabitants are a set of rules which are mainly aimed to ensure that the castle's health continues from one generation to another. The main rule among all these is that there should be no change, which is ironic because the castle itself, as I've said earlier, is always changing in response to changing seasons and light and temperature and the beings that come and go within its structure. Governing all of these rules is an immense book or tome of rituals, which is used to organize the lives of the inhabitants of the castle, mainly, in fact, the lives of the rulers of the castle. So one could say that the rulers are as much under the control of the rules as the rest of the inhabitants. So it's a very strange and haunting book, which I think C.S. Lewis said gave the reader the impression that they'd been presented with an entirely new way of seeing, which would from then on be considered by them as something like the Gormenghastly way of seeing the world. And one starts seeing echoes of Gormenghast Castle everywhere about one as one walks about after reading the book for the first time. And the book I'm mainly going to be talking about is the first book in the Gormenghast sequence called Titus Groan. And in that book, an inheritor of the Groan mantle, the 77th Earl Groan, is born and grows up only to the age of around 2 by the end of the novel. From that point of view, it's a little bit like Tristram Shandy, which is an autobiography which ends with its protagonist reaching about the age of 5. In this book, we mostly spend our time looking at the responses of the castle's inhabitants and of the young man from the kitchens who is seeking power, called Steerpike, as he gradually rises his way through the hierarchy of the castle and begins to reach towards what he ultimately wants, which is control over its people.
Yeah, I think that's a really good description. And Titus, who is the title character of the novel, barely appears in it.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
carried around. He doesn't really instigate any plot points apart from being born. That's the one thing he instigates is the next line of the Groan dynasty. And it's a really strange novel that the villain almost is the main character of this novel. And you're right about the castle as well. The castle, to me, it didn't work as a real building in a way because it keeps changing and people go down corridors that don't make any sort of sense. It's a very odd building, and perhaps we can talk a bit more about that later. But we're also interested in when you first discovered the novel and what you first made of it when you first read it.
I think many people first discover the novel in their teens. And I suppose its strangeness is one of the things that strikes you first as a young person, because you're maybe used to reading adventure stories which have young people as their heroes and following the young person's adventure and thinking of that person as, in some sense, growing into a position of being the hero of his or her story. In this case, however, the young person that we're introduced to near the beginning of the novel, Steerpike, is also its antagonist, is the one who is murdering people and burning libraries, generally kind of causing mayhem as he crawls his way to the top of the heap. And yet he also is intensely conscious of himself as somebody who is, in some sense, a boy's own hero from the old magazines, the boy's own magazines, which were initially established as encouraging manly qualities in the sons of missionaries. Mervyn Peake, in fact, was the son of a missionary. So the encounter with Steerpike is weirdly like an encounter with somebody who ought to be a hero and is aware of himself as capable of playing the hero. So at one point, Steerpike undergoes this fantastically epic climb across the walls and roofs of the castle of Gormenghast, discovering vistas which have never been seen by any human eye before, with storks and distant swimming horses in pools on the roofs of this gigantic castle. And through that period, one is intensely conscious of Steerpike as being the traditional boy adventurer He's about 17 years old. But Peake is very clear in stating to us that he's not really that adventurer. He's someone who has no heart or soul in the adventures that he's describing, but uses them only as a way of manipulating other people. It's a fascinating double vision, which is absolutely central to the castle and to Steerpike's character, and makes him one of the most interesting literary figures of literary history, I think. My own discovery of Steerpike was maybe quite appropriate. I was given the book by my English teacher, a man called Rory Stewart, to read while I was ill. And I had a pretty high fever when I started to read. And I feel that my initial impressions of the book were entirely woven around or sort of, affected and transformed by this fever I was undergoing. I would recommend that as a really good state of mind and body to first encounter the book in. But it's also quite good to encounter it as a teenager, I think, because it does sort of seem to transform and sort of radicalize your world in a way that not many books about teenagers do. I suppose there was another thing in my own encounter with the book, which has become important over time, and I think was important then too, which is to some extent I share Peake's background in that I grew up overseas, the son of, in my case, of a diplomat, and I think that the sense of strangeness and alienation that the book is full of is no doubt the product of two things. One is having inhabited a culture which he was conditioned by his education and parenting and even by the physical surroundings who he grew up in to see as not his own. So he lived inside a kind of enclave, a European enclave in Tianjin, or in those days called Tianjin, not very far from Beijing. So he grew up in this enclave of Europeanism in the middle of the city. And outside the walls of the enclave, as he says in one of his autobiographical sketches, was China. And he went into China to go to school. And he spoke Mandarin and remembered his Mandarin through much of his life. And I think China echoes right the way through his writings and his drawings and so forth. Some of his drawings are intensely influenced by Chinese art. At the same time, he returned to England at the age of 11. I returned to England myself, or came to England really for the first time at the age of 6 or 7. So I was much younger. Coming back at the age of 11, I think, would mean that, that there'd be a whole chunk of your life which you remembered as being entirely incompatible with and inconsistent with the new life you found yourself in what was supposed to be your own country, but which was a country that was also completely alien to you. So this sense of kind of alienation in the place that was supposed to be home is something which I think is central to the generation of Gormenghast Castle, which is something important to say about it is that it's cut off from the world. There's no sense that there is a world beyond the castle. The furthest you really get in terms of the inhabitants' awareness of what's beyond is Gormenghast Mountain, which is a forested kind of accumulation of crags, which is closely associated by way of ritual and performance and imaginary status with the castle it exists beside. But beyond that, there are no names of places, there are no countries, there's no indication of where the food for Gormenghast comes from. There's no sense that, that there's traffic of any kind. There's no trade that's going on with the world beyond Gormenghast. The castle is entirely self-contained. And I think right at the core of Gormenghast, at the core of Mervyn Peake's own experience as a human being, was this sense of a gulf, a gap, a sort of something that cut him off from the places that he lived in.
I think that's really interesting. And one thing that constantly came into my mind when I was reading the novel was, where do the people in Gormenghast come from? Because it's so hermetically sealed, and the only character that really crosses that boundary is from the sort of village outside of Gormenghast, is Cada, the wet nurse, essentially, who looks after Titus. And that's the only person you see really cross the wall from that direction. Some of the characters go out of the castle, but you never see anybody go in apart from this one person. So it sort of raises the question, are all the people in the castle descended from the original inhabitants of the castle? It's such a strange thing that isn't addressed in the novel, because I think if it was addressed in the novel, it would lose a bit of that mysterious nature of how this castle can survive by being so cut off from the world outside.
Yes, I think the notion that these characters even have pasts seems to be non-existent in the book. There's a little bit of reference to Cada's younger days. She was married at one point and her husband died, and it was after that that she was brought as wet nurse into the castle. But the rest of them, you don't know about the childhood of, for instance, the doctor figure, Dr. Prunesqualler. You don't know where the Countess of Groan came from, although she must have come from somewhere outside the Groan family in order to be able to marry the Earl of Groan, Lord Sepulchrave. There's no sense that the servant Flay, who's another of the major characters in the book, really has much in the way of a childhood beyond simply gradually being shaped over time into what he is now. And I think the refusal to give them backgrounds is a refusal to be bound by the regulations or maybe the conventions that are supposed to define the way human beings interact with one another in our own world. It's a refusal, if you like, of a kind of ideological or political position, which insists that you can only really understand people in certain ways and not in others. Peake wants to understand his characters by their actions, their movements, their speech, their appearance. He's not concerned with what's class or ethnicity or background or location they come from beyond the one location that he gives as the setting for everything in the book, which is this extraordinary castle. And I think there's maybe a reason for this. Or they may not have begun by being a reason exactly, but I think in the end that there is this sense that he wants to break free of a set of narrative and artistic assumptions which he feels as deeply entrapping. And you can see why you would feel those conventions as entrapping in the period that the novel's being written in. It's very important to bear in mind that this is a novel which is the product of war. He starts writing it at the beginning of the Second World War when he's been drafted into the army, a place which he finds utterly intolerable. He's unable to follow very basic military instructions. He's constantly dropping things. He set fire to his bed while serving as a gunner in the artillery. I mean, this is really not a good idea when you're surrounded by high explosives. And eventually he had a breakdown and was invalided out of the army into the hospital at Southport, which is one of many representations, one of many buildings that might have resembled Gormenghast in his imagination, and where he was given as therapy for his breakdown the task of continuing to write the novel. So, he's surrounded by rules and regulations which are supposed to guide a person's life, but he's determined to have his life guided by what he sees, by what he feels, by what he is convinced by in his own heart, as opposed to being imposed on him by various forms of propaganda. And his poetry shows him very, very conscious of the presence of propaganda all around, and propaganda from all sides, from the extremely reactionary conservative propaganda, which might guide a whole range of British society, through to the radical propaganda of political parties which are deeply opposed to the structure of Britain at the time, to the ideology that governed Britain. But all of these spheres seem, I think, to someone like Peake, to be restrictive, controlling, commandeering, seeking, in fact, to take control of the imagination and the creativity of the artist. So, in many ways, I think Peake's Gormenghast could be seen as a response to the problem of making art under these conditions.
The characters, I think particularly Steerpike, who is a 17-year-old boy. You don't know who his parents are. They're never mentioned. Any background to him. You know he worked in the kitchen, but you don't know how he got there. He moves through the castle as this mysterious figure, and I think it gives the novel, or certainly the character, this dangerous freedom. He could do anything in that world, and he's clever and sly, and you don't know how he got this education, and you don't know how he got this power to manipulate people. And he just seems like a complete mystery within the center of this mysterious novel. When you're reading it, you genuinely don't know if he's going to become the Earl of Groan, if he's going to get caught, if he's going to murder everybody. Anything could happen because this character is a complete, not a blank slate, but he doesn't have an anchor to anything real.
He's not held back by ethical considerations. In one way, he might be seen as something of a piratical figure. Peake was absolutely fascinated by pirates, not just in his childhood, but right the way through his life. And I think that's quite an interesting way of approaching someone like Steerpike. Steerpike resembles, in some ways, the main character in Peake's favorite novel, which was Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. That was his favorite novel as a child, to the extent that has said to have been able to quote large chunks of it by heart. He went on to illustrate it as an artist, with perhaps the greatest illustrations made for that book by anyone, and some of his greatest illustrations. And his pictures of Jim, the young boy who undergoes the adventures in Treasure Island, are very close to the illustrations he does for his books, his Titus books, for Titus Groan. But the idea of the pirate is something that runs through Steerpike's blood. I'm thinking maybe more perhaps in the second book, which is called Gormenghast, than in the first, but it's present in the first as well. He shows this kind of childish enthusiasm and energy and wildness, which what might make one think a little bit about another boy character who is closely associated with pirates, which is Peter Pan. And you remember that in Peter Pan, Peter himself is represented as a deeply dangerous character. He's one who very nearly gets Wendy killed near the beginning of the book, Peter and Wendy, just because he gets distracted by something while they're flying to Neverland. And he flies off, leaving the kids from London sort of flapping around in the air with no idea of where they're going. And if you think about piracy as an idea that governs Gormenghast and the whole novel of Titus Groan, you could say that the castle itself is rather like a ship. And at various points, it's very specifically compared metaphorically to a ship. It's unconnected to anything. It's surrounded by a landscape which is equivalent to a vast ocean, which nobody can cross in order to get to the rest of the world. And I suppose one of the things about pirates is that they're untrammeled by rules and regulations and conventions, except the ones that they invent for themselves. And they're also governed by their desires, the spontaneous desires, and by violence. And violence is something else that one notes in Titus Groan. It culminates in various moments of extreme violence, the most obvious one being that duel between the servant Flay and the chef Swelter. But there are other acts of violence right the way through the book, which sort of seem almost as if they're the culmination of the elaborate settings that Peake has created in the course of the novel.
The violence in the book, I thought, was quite romantic. I'm thinking particularly of the duel between Bragon and Runtel, which is described in bloody and horrific terms, but ends in such a romantic, unlikely way of them both killing each other and dying essentially on top of each other. This is not a condemnation of violence. It's a use of violence in a fictional sense to, as you say, bring a climax about, but it's a romantic climax as opposed to the violence that Peake was probably witnessing as he was writing the book in the world at that time, as you mentioned.
I really like your point that it's romantic violence. Peake is often associated with and associated himself with the idea of romanticism. He's connected by David Gifford to the New Romantic movement, which published his work in various forms in anthologies, and by the New Romantic Press, which was called the Grey Walls Press. So if he had a political affiliation, it was with this movement called New Romanticism. Whether he did or not, I'm not sure, but he's often described as totally apolitical. But I think that's often a term which is used for people who tend to be drawn to anarchism, which refuses forms of political control which are governed by authoritarianism of various kinds, which might include, for instance, communist socialism, which is governed by a party, or indeed, of course, the authoritarianism of the British state. But anarchism can be seen by many as an apolitical movement. But Peake was clearly deeply drawn to it, as were many, indeed, of his artist friends, such as Leslie Hurry and a whole range of others. But going back to this idea of the romanticism of violence, I suppose the romantic movement is kind of, in some ways, kind of seduced and delighted by violence in the form of revolution. Later romantics, especially, were drawn to the idea of revolution, which would free up people to live and exist in ways that were true to themselves and to their own experience of the world, rather than to the various controlling rituals and conventions which were imposed on them by education and upbringing. One could say that Stevenson's Treasure Island romanticizes violence in various ways. And the fight between Bryagon and Rantel that you describe culminates in one of the young men flinging a dagger at the other and killing him while dying himself of his wounds. And that moment is directly stolen from Treasure Island. There's a great point in Treasure Island when Long John Silver kills one of the people who won't join his mutiny to become a pirate by flinging his knife at him. Peake was so obsessed with that particular moment that he does it again in Gormenghast when Flay is killed by a knife being flung at him, by Steerpike in this case. So Steerpike again becomes a Treasure Island pirate, if you like. It's maybe worth saying that the fight that you describe between Bryagon and Rantel is particularly interesting because they are the two rival lovers of Caeda, the woman from the village outside the castle. And both of them are artists. More specifically, they're sculptors. And Peake was as interested in sculpture as he was in other forms of visual art. He wrote a wonderful poem about a sculpture by Epstein called Adam, which was being widely reviled in the art world in 1939 when it was first displayed. It ended up actually becoming a peep show in Bournemouth. But Peake wrote a passionate defense of the sculpture, and it's one of the best poems he wrote, I think. But the fight between Bryagon and Rantel is described as though they were doing the sculptures, which are their livelihoods. This is their raison d'etre. They're both sculptures. They love sculpting, particularly in wood. And they're both hacking away at each other with their knives as if they were hacking away at a root or a trunk of one of the trees they use for their sculptures. So the romanticizing from that point of view almost makes art itself into a work of violence, a form of violence. And one could say that that had always been something of Peake's approach to art. It's interesting how many of his early attempts at writing novels and literature and so on have extreme violence involved in them in various ways. It's as if he's acknowledging the influence of the kind of imperialist forms of violence which were romanticized in the boy's own stories as he read when young on his experience of creativity. Now, at a time when a global war was breaking out, this attitude to art, which sees violence itself as in some sense beautiful and integral to the way the world operates, and there are elements of truth about that, clearly. But at the same time, when you have this appalling global bloodshed and become conscious of the way that Europe is being oppressed and being bombarded and being invaded and all the rest of it, then your own attitude to art becomes deeply problematic if you yourself are attracted to various forms of violence as an integral part of the human experience. And I think that Steerpike could be seen as a response to that deep anxiety over the status of the artist, the position of the artist in this world which is driven and compelled by mechanized violence as embodied by the Nazi war machine and indeed by the British war machine in response to that. From that point of view, Steerpike becomes this kind of figure who is both strangely artistic and energetic in the way that he's able to create adventures for himself by crawling across the rooftops of Gormenghast, or make up elaborate, extravagant stories to seduce Fuchsia into accepting him into the service of the Groan family. But he's also somebody whose heart is cold and who is indifferent to the people who he's manipulating, and actually takes a worrying pleasure in the pain and torment that he inflicts. Most obviously when he drives the Earl of Groan, Sepulchrave, insane by burning his library, an act which has very often been associated by readers with the burning of books by the Nazi Party. But for Peake, this burning of the books is not an ideological gesture. It's a game. It's play. And from that point of view, it's in a sense allied with works of creativity. One of the most interesting and strangest artistic production in the Second World War was a catalogue of the works of the artist Adolf Hitler. And each of these works in the catalogue is given a title which is drawn from the tradition of academic visual arts. So it might be portrait of a young girl, it might be a family portrait, it might be self-portrait. But each of these pictures in the catalogue documents an atrocity committed by Hitler, so that Europe becomes the canvas on which the failed artist Adolf Hitler is executing his artistic ambitions. And the young girl portrait is one of a girl with a bullet hole in her chest. The family group is a group of refugees, obviously starving. And the self-portrait of Adolf himself is particularly interesting because he's staring into, as it were, the mirror of the picture. But as he's looking at himself, you can see that there are beads of sweat breaking out on Hitler's forehead. His eyes are wide and staring, almost owl-like, as if he's going slightly insane, with the horror of contemplating himself as this appalling alternative artist who is executing his art on the canvas of the world, of the earth. And that sort of capability of seeing the link between the art that the Peake lived by and loved and the appalling devastation which was going on around him is something I think which drives Titus Groan.
We've talked a little bit about the poetry of Peake, and I wonder how Peake's poetry is connected to his fiction, how the language and how the presentation of the fictional scene is that indebted to his poetry, do you think?
Well, as you know, I edited his poems myself, and with enormous support from the late Peter Winnington, who co-edited the nonsense poetry with me. I chose to divide the poems into two parts, one of which is the kind of the serious poetry, if you like, which I put in as his collected poems, and the other part which is called the nonsense poems. We called it the complete nonsense because we thought that was funny. Interestingly, Titus Groan is a book that's full of poetry, including poetry which is never actually uttered, such as the song that Swelter promises to his swarm of adoring kitchen boys near the beginning of the book, and which he never sings. But actually, Peake did write that song, and we put it into the complete nonsense. But all of these songs and poems that run through Titus Groan and the other Gormenghast books are nonsense. So there's this way that nonsense is somehow the music or the poetry of Peake's heart and of his imagined world. A kind of refusal of the kind of rationales, the cause and effect continuities which are supposed to control people's lives and which bind them to their traditions and origins and to the various structures that enclose them. The serious poems, which we published as a collected poems, are particularly interesting to me in that they show a very close awareness of contemporary events that are going on. There are poems like September 1939. There's the consumptive Bergen-Belsen 1945. All of these poems, or many of these poems, have very specific allusions to contemporary events and other moments which are acknowledged in the history books as key points in the evolution of war, the breakout of war. And mixed in with these poems are the poems which are extraordinarily kind of Gormenghast-like. Most obviously the poems which he published in his first poetry collection, Shapes and Sounds, which are poems about the experience of living in London during the Blitz, and his fascination especially by the bizarre shapes that the bombarding of London left behind. So that there were kind of buildings whose interiors, whose bedrooms and furnishings and so on were exposed to the weather by the demolition of the outside walls. He drew these buildings and he imagined them and reconstructed them, and I think they all get woven into the fabric of the castle of Gormenghast. But there's an intense alertness to the presence of these shapes around him in the poetry, which is magnificently demonstrated by the collection Shapes and Sounds. If you like, the poetry offers the link between the world that Peake inhabited and the world that he created.
To what extent would you categorize Titus Groan or the Gormenghast trilogy really as a whole as war novels or books inspired by war?
I think they're wholly war novels, all three of them in various ways. What's interesting is that the three books are all very different. The first book, Titus Groan, is much more intensely a war novel, as you might expect. It was published in 1946. It was written as therapy after leaving the army in 1942. It was written in spaces between his duties as a soldier in the first part of the war and in between his duties as a war artist in the latter part of the war. It's very much a war book. Gormenghast, which is the second book, which he wrote mostly in his beloved island of Sark, and it's full of a kind of affection and delight in Gormenghast and the castle, which is not really so much present in the first book, where it's oppressive and controlling and deeply cold. But in Gormenghast, the second book, it becomes a warm place in which Fuchsia, for example, the young daughter of the Earl of Groan, and Titus Groan himself, as he grows to childhood and adolescence, finds a kind of found family among the bizarre occupants of the castle, most obviously in the figures of Dr. Prunescaller, who, like Peake's own father, is a medical doctor. But at the same time, the castle remains oppressive to Titus because it's constantly seeking to control his youthful delight in the universe that surrounds him. And eventually, at the end of Gormenghast, he leaves. And in the third book, Titus Alone, he finds himself in a dystopian world of the future where there are dazzlingly fast airplanes and where scientists are working on some appalling nuclear style war device which will destroy things. Seems to be some kind of laser or something like that. So the third book really mutates from being a war book in the sense of the first, which was a Second World War book, into a war book in the sense of a response to the Cold War. So there's very much a sense that all three books emerge from a war environment. Perhaps the second, Gormenghast, is the one that's least a war book, but at the same time, it's filled with shadows of war, I think. And it's and that continued presence of war as a driving force in Peake's imagination is most obviously demonstrated in his poetry, where he continues through the 1940s, through the second half of the 1940s, while he's in Sark, to write poems which are very strongly kind of resonant of war experiences. The most striking of those, maybe, is the Rime of the Flying Bomb, which is a ballad he wrote, somewhat reminiscent of the great ballad that he illustrated, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But he wrote that maybe around 1948, something like that. So some few years after the war had ended. But after that, it seems that the Cold War begins to infiltrate his consciousness. And maybe partly his horror at Cold War might have been affected by its sheer coldness, something which we've repeatedly identified as a challenge to his work as an artist.
Reading Titus Groan, it's not immediately apparent that it is a book inspired by war. It seems very distant. It seems certainly in the sort of fantasy mode, which is quite familiar. That sort of mid-century fantasy, I think, is quite familiar to readers. So I wonder where the Gormenghast trilogy sits in comparison to other members of that mid-century fantasy fiction, certainly the most influential period of fantasy fiction, such as Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Where does Gormenghast fit there?
Yes, of course, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings has sometimes been described as a war book in that it's generated in part and contains very strong resonances of his service in the Great War. Many people in the Great War seem to have been unable to articulate their experiences until some time later. A really great example was another great writer artist like Mervyn Peake, David Jones, who wrote about his experiences in the war only in the 19th, well, published them in the 1930s in a book called In Parenthesis, which Peake would have been aware of, just as he would have been aware of the fact that David Jones illustrated The Ancient Mariner. But why turn away from the world that you inhabit if you're going to end up by writing about it within it? You know, the dead marshes in The Lord of the Rings, in The Two Towers, the second volume, is so obviously like the devastated battlefields of the Great War. But at the same time, the rest of The Lord of the Rings doesn't really seem to bear much comparison with the mechanized industrial mass killings of that war. And in just the same way, as you say, Titus Groan self-consciously locates itself in a period where there don't seem to be much in the way of guns. They don't seem to have infiltrated the castle. There's no lasers in the castle. There's no modern technology of any kind. It's an odd kind of castle, though, because it's not like Tolkien's medievalism. There are kind of modern elements, like Dr. Prunesqualler's medicines, for example. His skills as a physician by no means seem to be those of a medieval physician. They're much more like the skills of Peake's own father. So it's an odd muddling and fusion of different periods. And one could say the same thing about The Lord of the Rings, which begins in what looks like a little bit of rural Edwardian England, which is the Shire, and gradually moves outwards into a medievalized, much more ancient-seeming world beyond the boundaries of the Shire. But why turn away from things in order to respond to them? I think very often that what you don't say and what you don't put in are the things which most strongly are pointed towards by the fictions and the works of art that we produce. But I think that fantasy is something which was a response by a huge, huge number of writers in the 20th century to a world which was spinning out of control, which was so rapidly rushing away from anything that they had been brought up to understand or believe in or to be morally in tune with, that people ended up by repeatedly turning away and writing things which were self evidently impossible, self evidently not about the world that they inhabited, and yet always and everywhere infiltrated by and corrupted by and kind of virally infected by the world that they lived in. Great examples would be, for instance, Kafka. Who wrote another book about a great castle, which was translated into English in the 1930s by Edwin and Willem Muir, and was immensely influential as soon as it came out. Writers like Rex Warner then began to mimic Kafka in attempting to write fantastic representations of the wartime situations that they felt they couldn't really address in realist terms. Rex Warner wrote a famous book called The Aerodrome, which was one of Burgess's 99 books, which is about a fascistic version of Great Britain. One could say maybe most simply that trying to write about one's own time and one's own place is always going to be difficult. So, people like Walter Scott end up writing historical novels as a way of describing the competing forces which they see as operating in the world that they live in. So people have always turned away in order to try and gain some sense of perspective. One suspects also so as not to get bogged down in fights with their contemporaries over how they're representing the present. I'm not sure that Peake began writing Titus Groan with any intention of representing his own world. I do think that he would have been aware of the fact that he couldn't do but represent his own world, because that's the world from which his own sprang. And it would always end up by throwing a new light on its source and origin. I mean, there are an amazing number of fantasy writers in the 1920s and 30s after the grand narratives of imperialism and of capitalism had been wholesalely demolished or restructured by the damage of the Great War.
Actually, one of the things when I was reading Titus Groan, one of the things I thought Peake was doing, he turns away from the real world with his fantasy setting, but also he turns away from, the way I saw it, he turns away from his time by harking back to people like Dickens. I thought Titus Groan had so much Dickens in it, in the way the characters are named and characterized, and the way the only class structure, I guess, in the book is those who live in Gormenghast and those who live outside of Gormenghast. But the sort of Dickensian lives of these people that live in the huts outside of Gormenghast struck me, and so it just struck me as that was one of his influences. Dickens's London seemed to be there in Gormenghast somewhere if you look hard enough.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, he was a great, great lover of Dickens. He was always passionate, particularly maybe about Bleak House, which is a very good model for any young novelist to use as a basis if they are going to write like a Dickens figure, because of its wonderful control, its structural control, as well as its extraordinary imagination. He went on, in fact, to illustrate Bleak House. He did wonderful drawings for it, which sadly never got published in book form, but are now available in books like Mervyn Peake, The Man and His Art, which was edited by Peter Winnington. He wrote a little poem even about seeing one of the men in one of the regiments that he joined as a Dickens character, and wishes that Dickens had been alive to be able to write about this man in a way that he deserved. And instead, Peake has to write a short poem about him. So he does draw on those older literatures. I think he's very fascinated by the fact that any modern artist has to take cognizance of a long, long tradition that lies behind them. He writes about it very beautifully and lyrically in the introduction to the collection of drawings that was published of his by the Grey Walls Press. He seems to have been quite an admirer of Ulysses, for example. There's records of him engaging in conversations about Ulysses. His wife, Maeve Gilmore, was a very avid reader and would read to Mervyn while he was drawing or painting. Maeve Gilmore is now beginning to be recognized as a really fine artist in her own right. But during their lifetimes, she often had to, as is often the case with women artists, find herself playing second fiddle to her more celebrated husband. So she would read to him, and she'd read a huge range of different kinds of novels and writings to him. And I think that woven in with his work is as much the more contemporary writing of people like Graham Greene, who was in fact the person who first encouraged him to publish Titus Groan, and Joyce, and certainly Virginia Woolf. He was a very interested in Virginia Woolf, and I think one can see many of the passages of Titus Groan as analogous to the wonderful passages in To the Lighthouse, for example, when you have the house on Skye being gradually transformed by the operation of time and the seasons while nobody's in it. So there are very clear kind of responses to the extremely up-to-date kind of literature that he was fascinated by, along with the older literature like Stevenson, Dickens. Another major influence on him, who could be described as rather a modern influence in the 20th century, was Herman Melville and Moby Dick, which he also seems to have adored. And another figure who was, in some sense, a modern figure in the 20th century was William Blake, another of Peake's great heroes, as you'd kind of expect, given that Blake was both a writer and artist, but also a revolutionary writer and a revolutionary artist who was at the same time resistant to being drawn into movements which were not true to his own artistic and political vision.
When you mention all those names, I think you can see flashes of them in Titus Groan. It's such a rich novel, and one that has obviously been built up by Peake's interests in all sorts of things. But I wonder, to flip that around, I wonder what Peake's legacy is today. Is his influence evident in writers that are working today, do you think?
Yes, I think it's evident in all sorts of writings, and I've noticed it everywhere. I'm not always sure whether these are direct influences, but at the same time, I can see the kind of writing that he produces, which is one which recognizes, if you like, the immediate impact of oppressive architectural structures on the minds and the shapes of the lives of those who are obliged to occupy them, is something which is present in an extraordinary range of wonderful writing today. So I made something of a list of some of the books I thought might have Peakian elements in them. I'm not going to call them influence, but I've recently been reading R.F. Kuang's amazing book Babel, which is about an Oxford which is dominated by the Institute of Translators, which ends up by being almost a quasi-military instrument of control over the British Empire in the 19th century. And it's all housed in this gigantic tower called Babel, which is very similar in appearance, it would seem, to the Tower of Babel as painted by Bruegel in his celebrated early modern paintings. There's Jeanette Ng's Under the Pendulum Sun, which is about missionaries who go to convert fairy to Christianity. They're British Victorian missionaries who set off to find fairy and convert its inhabitants, and find themselves housed in a castle which is very similar to Gormenghast, and in which they themselves reenact some of the more Gothic and extreme forms of Victorian literature, which would have appealed to Peake himself. One writer who has acknowledged his direct influence from Peake is China Miéville, the socialist writer of weird fiction. Perhaps his most Peakian novel is Perdido Street Station, which transmogrifies London into a kind of vast, decaying metropolitan spread, which seemed to be entirely self-fed and self-consumed, like Gormenghast itself, without much allusion to what lies beyond its reaches. Maybe another example I might offer, which is might be familiar to a number of people, is Susanna Clarke's Piranesi, which is all set in a gigantic house, which is very much like a drawing by the celebrated 18th century drawer of prisons, Piranesi, and which is inhabited by a man who seems to be in some way trapped there, and to have been trapped there by a cold fish-like being who occasionally comes to visit him and try to make use of him for his own purposes. So there's been an extraordinary kind of wealth of material that's come out of Peake, but each of the writers who draw on Peake seem to me to be entirely like Peake, in some sense sui generis. They don't quite fit into schools or models of the way writing is being conducted just now. They tend to be doing things which are a little skew, a little different. And it's interesting that that difference manifests itself by a kind of cleaving to or a kind of echo of the difference which Peake represents and which Burgess pays tribute to in his introduction to Titus Groan.
I think that's indicative of quite a lot of influential writers, is that people that are influenced by them don't want to write like them, but they can't sort of shrug off some details or some aesthetic or some use of language or that sort of thing. So it's good to see that his work is infiltrating such a varied cast of novelists working today, I suppose. Our last question is one that we ask to everybody who comes on the 99 Novels podcast. If you could add a 100th novel to Burgess's list, what would it be and why?
I think that I would add Amos Tutuola's The Palm Wine Drinkard. The reason for that is, well, there are several reasons for it. One is that the 99 novels stretches from 1939 to 1983. And in that period, I think Amos Tutuola's intervention is a hugely important one. It's one of the first novels by a Nigerian novelist to enter the consciousness of the world beyond. There's a playful awareness in Tutuola that he is, if you like, introducing the Nigerian imagination or the Yoruba imagination to the world in a way in which it has not been introduced before. And there's an exuberance of invention, a brilliance of weaving together of the experiences of traditional folktale and the modern world in the form of telephones and other pieces of technology which somehow find their way in to the narratives that Tutuola describes, along with a playful but dark recognition of the presence of power play and economic control and indeed linguistic control, because Tutoro chose to write in English and wrote in an English which quite self-consciously resists being conventional English as spoken by the ruling classes of Great Britain, of imperialist Britain. So I think I'd bring that in partly because it satisfyingly tallies with the moment when Titus Groan was published. So it was written in 1946, so it wasn't published till the 1950s. Also because I think it's been immensely influential. It weaves its way, for instance, into Ben Okri's The Famished Road and the work of Ben Okri, and continues to find kind of echoes and responses in the great fantasies that have been written by writers of African descent in the 21st century, as well as in the 20th. There are various ways, I think, that it feeds into the history of fantasy in a way which is not dissimilar from the peculiarities of Titus Groan, and the way that weaves both into the history of fantasy and into more so-called mainstream fiction.
Well, I think that's an interesting choice. I think just from this episode alone, our reading lists have grown so much that so many books mentioned that, I certainly want to read. So thank you very much for joining us on the 99 Novels podcast. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you.
It's been a huge pleasure for me. Thank you.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. Mervyn Peake collected poems edited by Rob Maslen, and Mervyn Peake Complete Nonsense, edited by Rob Maslen and G. Peter Winnington, are both out now. For more information about Anthony Burgess and to support the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit anthonyburgess.org. You can subscribe to the Burgess Foundation's free weekly newsletter at anthonyburgessfoundation.substack.com.